The silver spoon didn't just feed Avery Sterling, it defined her. At 23, Avery's life was a masterclass in curated perfection. She was the only daughter of Richard and Eleanor Sterling, names that carried weight in the upper echelons of New York's legal and philanthropic circles. She had the Sterling jawline, or so everyone said, and the same penchant for rare Scotch and mid-century modern art as her father. She was currently finishing her first year at Columbia Law, her path toward a junior partnership at her father's firm already paved with gold leaf intentions. The day the world tilted on its axis started with something as mundane as a university blood drive. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of New York morning where the air feels like a crisp, new $100 bill. Avery had stepped into the mobile donation unit on campus, offering her arm with the practiced grace of someone who had been taught that noblesse oblige was a lifestyle, not just a phrase. "Oh, negative?" the nurse asked, glancing at Avery's previous records. "Yes," Avery replied, smiling. "The universal donor. My father always says it's the most sterling thing about me, always giving back." She hadn't thought about it again until 3 weeks later, when a certified letter arrived at her penthouse apartment. It wasn't from the Red Cross. It was from a private clinical laboratory associated with the university's genomic research department. "Discrepancy in genetic markers," the letter stated. "Please contact Dr. Eris Thorne for a follow-up consultation regarding your recent screening." Avery sat in Dr. Thorne's office 2 days later. The room smelled of ozone and expensive floor wax. Dr. Thorne, a man whose bedside manner was as warm as a dry ice bath, laid a series of charts on the mahogany desk. "Ms. Sterling, when you donated blood, you opted into our Genomic Health Initiative study," Thorne began, his eyes fixed on the paper. "During the routine sequencing of your markers to check for hereditary predispositions, we found something anomalous." Avery leaned forward, her heart doing a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. "A health issue? Am I sick?" "No," Thorne said, finally looking up. "Quite the opposite. You are perfectly healthy. However, your DNA profile was cross-referenced with a public database, a standard procedure when we find rare sequences. The discrepancy isn't in your health, Avery. It's in your parentage." He slid a folder toward her. "Genetically speaking, there is a 0,00% probability that Richard and Eleanor Sterling are your biological parents. Furthermore, we found a direct match in our system. A woman named Maya Harding, born on the same day, at the same hospital, St. Jude's Memorial, carries the genetic markers that match your parents perfectly." The air left the room. Avery felt as though she were underwater, the sound of Thorne's voice becoming a distant, muffled hum. "Switched?" she whispered. "It appears so," Thorne said. "St. Jude's was hit by a massive power failure and a localized flood the night you were born. The neonatal unit was evacuated in the dark. It's a tragedy, but it seems there was a clerical error in the chaos." Avery didn't go back to her penthouse. She drove straight to the Sterling estate in Westchester. The iron gates swung open as they always did, but as she pulled her Audi up the gravel driveway, the limestone mansion looked like a stranger's house. The confrontation was worse than the news itself. Eleanor Sterling didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply set her teacup down with a terrifyingly precise clink and stared at the DNA report as if it were a vulgar piece of tabloid gossip. "This is an administrative error," Eleanor said, her voice like shards of ice. "Richard, call the board of directors at St. Jude's. I want this Thorne person fired by morning." But Richard Sterling, a man who had won 100 trials by reading the truth in people's eyes, didn't reach for the phone. He looked at Avery, really looked at her, and she saw it. For the first time in 23 years, he wasn't looking at his daughter. He was looking at a stranger who had been sleeping in his house. "The blood type," Richard muttered. "I always wondered why you were O negative when Eleanor and I are both AB. I thought it was a mutation. A rarity." "Richard, Don't be absurd, Eleanor hissed. It's true, isn't it? Avery's voice trembled. You've always felt it? That I didn't quite fit. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Avery had ever heard. It was the sound of a family bond dissolving in real time. Avery spent the next 48 hours in a fever dream of private investigators and internet deep dives. If she wasn't a Sterling, who was she? The answer lay 40 miles away in a town called Oak Haven, a place the Sterlings would only drive through if their GPS malfunctioned. The Hardings lived in a trailer park at the edge of the woods, a place where the rust on the cars was more permanent than the paint. Avery pulled up in her Audi, feeling like a fluorescent alien in a gray world. She walked toward trailer number 42, her designer heels sinking into the mud. Her heart was in her throat. She expected a scene from a movie, a tearful mother, a father who looked at her with awe, a sense of coming home. She knocked. The man who opened the door was Silas Harding. He was thin, with skin like cured leather and eyes that seemed to be perpetually squinting against the sun. He wore a stained undershirt and held a lukewarm beer. Behind him, the trailer smelled of stale tobacco and boiled cabbage. "Can I help you, princess?" Silas spat, looking at her expensive coat. My name is Avery," she started, her voice cracking. I think I'm your daughter." There was a switch at St. Jude's. 23 years ago. Silas didn't move. He didn't gasp. He didn't pull her into an embrace. He simply leaned against the doorframe and took a slow, deliberate sip of his beer. "Avery Sterling," he said, his voice a low growl. "I've seen your face in the papers. The socialite. The law student." A woman appeared behind him, Martha Harding. She was gray-faced and weary, her eyes darting between Avery and the luxury car parked in the dirt. "You're the one," Martha whispered. "The one who took it all." "I didn't take anything," Avery said, stepping forward, desperate for a connection. "I didn't know. I want to get to know you. I want to make this right." Silas stepped out onto the small metal porch, looming over her. The reunion energy Avery had hoped for was non-existent. Instead, there was a palpable, vibrating resentment. "Make it right." Silas laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "You spent 20 years eating steak while my Maya, the real Sterling girl, was eating generic mac and cheese. You went to private schools while she worked the night shift at a gas station to pay for my medicine. You've lived a life that cost millions of dollars. Our life. Her life." "I'm sorry," Avery cried, tears finally breaking through. "I'll help. I'll talk to the Sterlings, we can." "Oh, we aren't looking for a talk, Avery," Silas interrupted. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded envelope, handing it to her with a smirk that didn't reach his cold eyes. "We already found a lawyer. A hungry one." Avery opened the envelope. It wasn't a letter of welcome. It was a formal summons. "Harding vs. Sterling, Avery. We're suing you, Avery," Silas said, his voice dropping to a hiss. "Unjust enrichment. You've consumed 23 years of resources that belong to us. You're a walking, talking stolen asset. Every meal you ate, every vacation you took, every cent of that tuition, it's a debt you owe to the Hardings. You're suing your own daughter." Avery whispered, horrified. "You ain't my daughter," Silas said, stepping back into the trailer. "You're just the girl who's been spending our money for 2 decades. See you in court, princess." The door slammed shut, leaving Avery standing in the mud, holding the legal papers that officially turned her life into a crime scene. The silence of the Sterling estate was a luxury Avery had always taken for granted. In the 48 hours following her visit to the Harding trailer, that silence was replaced by a deafening, relentless roar. It started with a leak. By Tuesday morning, A grainy photo of Avery standing in the mud outside trailer number 42 was on the front page of every major tabloid. The headline in the New York Post was a jagged blade of text: "The Princess and the Poverty, Sterling Heiress discovers she's a squatter in her own life." Social media was worse. The hashtag thief of fate began to trend. The narrative was perfect for the digital age: a wealthy, beautiful girl who had inadvertently stolen the life of a girl struggling in poverty. To the world, Avery wasn't a victim of a hospital error, she was a symbol of systemic inequality. Every Instagram post she had ever made photos of her skiing in Aspen, her 21st birthday party at the Pierre, her summer internship in London was being recirculated as evidence exhibit by millions of strangers. Inside the Sterling penthouse on Park Avenue, the air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and desperation. Richard Sterling was on his third phone, his voice a low, rhythmic growl as he spoke to the firm's PR crisis team. Eleanor sat by the floor-to-ceiling window, staring at the sidewalk 20 stories below, where news vans were parked like vultures. "They're calling it unjust enrichment, Richard," Eleanor said, her voice brittle. "How can a child be sued for the cost of her own upbringing? It's barbaric." "It's a strategic nightmare," Richard countered, hanging up. He looked at Avery, who was curled in a velvet armchair, still wearing the same clothes from the day before. "The Hardings have hired Marcus Vane. He's a shark. He doesn't want a settlement, he wants a spectacle. He's arguing that every dollar we spent on Avery was a dollar we should have spent on their biological daughter, the girl who spent her life in a trailer." Avery looked up, her eyes hollow. "What about Maya? Have you talked to her?" Richard's expression shifted. It was a fleeting look, a mix of guilt and a hunger he couldn't hide. "We've reached out through legal channels. She's coming to the mediation today. With the Hardings." "You want to see her?" Avery whispered. Eleanor didn't deny it. "She is our blood, Avery. As much as this pains us, we cannot ignore the fact that our child has been suffering while we gave you the world." The "you" felt like a physical blow. The "we" no longer included her. The mediation took place in a sterile, glass-walled conference room at a midtown law firm. The table was a vast expanse of polished oak, a physical barrier between two families that were now inextricably and painfully linked. Avery arrived first with the Sterling legal team. She wore a simple black dress, no jewelry, and her hair pulled back, a desperate attempt to look less like an heiress. Then, the door opened. Silas and Martha Harding walked in, looking uncomfortable in cheap, stiff suits that smelled of mothballs. But Avery didn't look at them. Her eyes were locked on the girl behind them. Maya. Maya Harding didn't look like a Sterling. While Avery was lithe and blonde, Maya was sharp-edged and dark-haired, with a gaze that looked like it had been forged in a furnace. She wore a faded denim jacket and sensible boots. Her hands were calloused, the hands of someone who had worked manual labor since they were 16. The silence in the room was suffocating. Richard Sterling stood up, his hand trembling slightly. "Maya." Maya didn't move. She didn't offer a smile or a tear. She looked at Richard, then at Eleanor, and finally, she turned her gaze toward Avery. It was a look of pure, unadulterated loathing. "So," Maya said, her voice raspy and cold. "This is the girl who got my room." Marcus Vane, the Hardings' lawyer, wasted no time. He slapped a thick binder onto the table. "Let's get the pleasantries out of the way," Vane said, grinning like a predator. "We aren't here for a family reunion. We are here for restitution. My client, Maya Harding, the rightful Avery Sterling, has lived a life of extreme hardship due to a mistake that benefited your client." He pointed a finger at Avery. "We have calculated the value of opportunity stolen from Maya," Vane continued. "Private school tuition from K through 12. 4 years at an Ivy League university. A trust fund. Networking opportunities. Healthcare. Even the caloric difference between the organic meals Avery ate and the processed food Maya was forced to consume. The total, adjusted for emotional distress and lost lifetime earnings, is $15 million. That's absurd, Richard snapped. Avery didn't choose this. No, but she consumed it, Vane retorted. She is in possession of a stolen education. A stolen social status. Every day she spends in that law school is a day she is using Maya's inheritance to build a future Maya was denied. We aren't just suing for money, we are suing for the return of the sterling name and all assets attached to it. During a break, the lawyers stepped out to discuss numbers. Avery stayed in the room. Maya stayed, too, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. I tried to find you, Avery said softly. After I found out. I wanted to help. Maya turned, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. Help? With what? A check? A sorry your life sucked card? You have no idea what it's like, Avery. To watch your father drink away the rent money while you're working double shifts at a diner, knowing deep down that you don't belong there. I used to look at girls like you on the news and wonder why the world was so unfair. Now I know. It's because you had my spot. I would give it back if I could, Avery said, her voice breaking. Then give it back, Maya challenged, stepping closer. The Sterlings, they look at me and they see a fix-it project. They've already offered me a room in the Westchester house. They offered to pay for a tutor so I can catch up. They're embarrassed by me, but they want me because I'm theirs. Maya leaned in, her voice a whisper. And you? You're just a reminder of the mistake. My parents, the Hardings, they don't love you. They see you as a lottery ticket. They're going to bleed you dry because they think you owe them for every meal they didn't give me. Avery realized then that she was a ghost. To the Sterlings, she was a beautiful lie they were trying to forget. To the Hardings, she was a golden goose they were ready to slaughter. As Avery left the building, the media swarm was waiting. Cameras flashed like strobe lights, blinding her. Avery. Is it true the Hardings are asking for $15 million? Maya says you're a fraud. Any comment? Do you feel guilty for being rich? A man in the crowd, a stranger with a phone held high, spat toward her car. Pay it back, you fake. He screamed. Inside the car, Avery curled into a ball on the leather seat. She realized that the unjust enrichment lawsuit wasn't just about money. It was about her right to exist. The Hardings were suing for her past, the Sterlings were reclaiming her future, and the world was cheering for her destruction. She looked at her hands, clean, soft, manicured hands. For the first time in her life, she hated them. The displacement happened not with a bang, but with the polite, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the Sterling library. A week after the mediation, the Sterling name felt like a suit of armor that had grown 3 sizes too small. Every time Avery walked through the marble foyer, she felt like a trespasser. The staff people who had watched her lose her first tooth and go to her first prom now averted their eyes, focusing intensely on polishing silver that didn't need polishing. We think it's best, Avery, Richard Sterling said, his voice devoid of its usual paternal warmth. He was sitting behind his mahogany desk, the same desk where he used to help her with her Latin homework. Now, it was covered in legal briefs and a vibrant, color-coded folder labeled Maya. Best for what, Dad? Avery asked, the word dad tasting like ash in her mouth. For the optics, Eleanor added, appearing in the doorway. She was holding a stack of high-end catalogs. She was already planning a renovation for the East Wing, the wing that had been Avery's sanctuary for 2 decades. Marcus Vane is painting a picture of us as hoarders of privilege. If you stay here while Maya is still living in that place, it looks like we are doubling down on the theft. We've leased a very nice corporate apartment for you in Soho, near the law school. You're kicking me out, Avery said. It wasn't a question. We are repositioning, Richard corrected. Until the lawsuit is settled. And Avery. I've had to temporarily freeze the secondary trust. Vane is threatening to freeze all sterling assets if we continue to subsidize your lifestyle with funds that he argues rightfully belong to his client. In the span of 10 minutes, Avery went from being the heiress to an empire to a guest who had overstayed her welcome by 23 years. If the Sterling Mansion was a freezer, Columbia Law School was a furnace. Avery walked down the hallowed halls of the Jerome Green Hall, her head down. The whispers followed her like a physical wake. In the lounge, a group of her friends, girls she had shared mimosas with just 2 weeks ago, suddenly found their textbooks incredibly fascinating as she approached. "Did you see the TikTok?" someone whispered as she passed. "The one where they compare her $10 Dior bag to the boots Maya had to wear to work in the rain." "Disgusting," another replied. "She should just give the money back. It's literally blood money." In her property law seminar, Professor Sterling, no relation, a bitter irony, decided to use the recent news as a hypothetical. If a party unknowingly consumes a resource that was intended for another, but that resource is intangible like an education or a social pedigree, is the debt financial or moral? The professor asked, his eyes landing squarely on Avery. Avery felt the blood drain from her face. 100 pairs of eyes turned toward her. She wasn't a student anymore, she was a case study. A curiosity. A thief who had stolen 23 years of intangible resources. She gathered her things and walked out mid-lecture, the sound of her own footsteps echoing like a heartbeat. Avery retreated to the corporate apartment, a cold, minimalist box of glass and steel that felt more like a prison cell than a home. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from her own lawyer, a woman named Sarah Jenkins, whom she had hired using the last of her accessible savings. "The Hardings have dropped the $15 million demand," the text read. "They've lowered it to a goodwill settlement of $5 million. But there's a catch." Avery met Sarah at a cramped coffee shop that evening. "What's the catch?" Avery asked. "The catch is Maya," Sarah said, sighing. "She's officially joined the lawsuit as a co-plaintiff. She signed an affidavit claiming that your usurpation of her life caused her irreparable psychological harm. Silas and Martha are demanding the $5 million specifically from your personal inheritance and trust. They don't want the Sterling's corporate money. They want yours. They want to bankrupt me," Avery realized. "They want to reset the clock," Sarah corrected. "They want you to start at zero, just like Maya did. If you sign this, you lose the trust, you lose the Soho apartment, and you likely have to drop out of law school. You'll have nothing but the clothes on your back and a degree you haven't finished. And if I don't, then we go to a jury trial. And right now, Avery, you're the most hated woman in New York. A jury will see a girl who grew up in a palace and a girl who grew up in a trailer. They won't care about the law. They'll care about justice. And justice, in their eyes, looks like taking everything you have." Desperate to understand the girl who was dismantling her life, Avery tracked Maya down. She didn't find her at the trailer park. She found her at a diner near the Sterling estate. Maya was sitting at the counter, staring at a burger she hadn't touched. Avery sat down 2 stools away. Maya didn't look up, but she stiffened. "You're following me now?" Maya asked. "I just wanted to talk. Without the lawyers. Without your father whispering in your ear." Maya turned her head slowly. Up close, the resemblance to Eleanor Sterling was haunting. The same high cheekbones, the same piercing gray eyes, but Maya's were tired, rimmed with the red exhaustion of a life spent treading water. "My father isn't whispering anything I don't already feel," Maya said. "He's a bastard, Avery. I know that. He's a drunk and he's mean. But he's the bastard I grew up with while you were being tucked into silk sheets by a man who actually knows how to speak in full sentences. I'm losing everything, Maya, Avery said, her voice trembling. The Sterlings, they've already moved my things. They're looking at me like I'm a ghost. Isn't that enough? Do you really need to take the money, too? Maya's expression didn't soften. If anything, it turned to stone. You think this is about the money? It's about the weight. I spent 23 years carrying the weight of being a Harding. The hunger, the shame, the way people look at you when you smell like wood smoke and cheap laundry soap. You've never felt a day of weight in your life. You're light, Avery. You're so light you're practically floating. Maya leaned in, her voice a sharp, jagged edge. I want you to feel the weight. I want you to know what it's like to wonder if you'll have a roof over your head next month. I want you to see the Sterlings look at me the way they used to look at you, and I want you to see them look at you and see nothing at all. You hate me because of a mistake I didn't make, Avery whispered. I hate you because you're the person I was supposed to be, Maya retorted. And you're doing a damn good job of playing the victim for someone who's had a 20-year head start on the rest of the world. Avery walked back to her Soho apartment in the rain, her designer coat soaked through. She felt the weight Maya had talked about. It was a crushing, physical pressure in her chest. She sat on the floor of the empty living room, surrounded by boxes of her Sterling Life books, designer shoes, photos of a family that didn't want her. She reached for a box she hadn't opened yet, a collection of her baby mementos Eleanor had sent over as a parting gift. Inside was her birth certificate, her hospital footprints, and a Polaroid of her in the St. Jude's nursery. Avery stared at the photo. She was a tiny, red-faced infant in a plastic bassinet. Next to her was another bassinet. The name on the card was Harding. She looked closer. Something caught her eye. In the background of the photo, a man was standing by the nursery glass. He wasn't looking at the babies with the joy of a new father. He was looking at the gold-plated Sterling bassinet with a look of intense, focused calculation. It was Silas Harding. And he wasn't wearing a hospital visitor's badge. He was wearing a maintenance uniform. Avery's law student brain clicked into gear. The hospital records said the switch happened during a chaotic flood and power outage. But Silas Harding had been there. He hadn't just been a father waiting for his child, he had been an employee with access to the floors. Avery wiped her eyes, the cold despair replaced by a sudden, flickering spark of suspicion. Maya wanted Avery to feel the weight of a life she didn't earn. But Avery was starting to wonder if Silas Harding had spent 23 years waiting for this exact moment to cash in on a tragedy he might have manufactured. She grabbed her laptop. She didn't need a trust fund to be a lawyer. She just needed a lead. The Soho apartment felt like a tomb of glass. Outside, the city hummed with a life Avery no longer belonged to, but inside, the only sound was the frantic tapping of her fingers against her laptop keys. Avery had traded her designer heels for thick wool socks and her legal textbooks for a sprawling map of hospital staff records from 23 years ago. She was no longer the Sterling heiress. She was a detective in her own tragedy. The photo from the nursery haunted her. Silas Harding, captured in a blurry reflection against the nursery glass, wearing a gray maintenance jumpsuit with a name patch she could almost read. If she could prove Silas was on that floor not as a panicked father, but as an employee with a master key, the unjust enrichment lawsuit wouldn't just be contested, it would be a crime scene. St. Jude's Memorial was a different world from the gleaming private clinics the Sterlings usually frequented. It was a labyrinth of beige hallways and flickering fluorescent lights in a part of the city that felt forgotten by time. Because of the clerical error scandal, the hospital was under intense scrutiny, and the records department was a fortress of bureaucracy. Avery used her last favor. A classmate from Columbia, a girl named Chloe whose father sat on the hospital's board, managed to get Avery a researcher's pass for the archives. "Don't get caught, Avery," Chloe whispered over the phone. "My dad thinks you're a liability right now. Everyone does. Avery spent 12 hours in the basement of St. Jude's. The air was thick with the smell of mold and old paper. She combed through microfiche and physical ledgers, her eyes burning. She wasn't looking for her own birth certificate, she was looking for a payroll ledger from October 19. She found it at 2 a.m. Payroll ledger, Maintenance Department, October 20th pay period. Employee, Harding, Silas. Position, Level 2 HVAC/General Maintenance. Shift, Emergency on Call, Flooding/Power Failure Response. Avery's breath hitched. Silas hadn't just been present during the chaos, he had been the man tasked with fixing the very power failure that had supposedly caused the accidental switch. He had a badge that granted him access to every ward, including the neonatal intensive care unit where the Sterling and Harding babies were being kept. But she needed more than a payroll slip. She needed a witness. The debutante of the ruins. While Avery sat in a basement surrounded by dust, the Sterlings were hosting a different kind of event. It was the introduction of Maya Sterling, a private gala at the Westchester estate to announce to their inner circle that the rightful heir had returned. Avery watched the event through the lens of a social media story posted by a former friend. The ballroom was draped in white orchids. Maya stood between Richard and Eleanor, wearing a deep emerald gown that had once been tailored for Avery. Maya looked uncomfortable, her shoulders hunched, her eyes darting toward the exits. She looked like a captive in a gilded cage. But Richard and Eleanor were beaming. They weren't looking at Maya's discomfort, they were looking at the blood match they had finally recovered. "She has the Sterling eyes," a guest commented in the video's caption. Avery closed her laptop. The Sterling eyes were currently being used to study the price of luxury, while Avery's fake eyes were scanning for a ghost. She felt a pang of pity for Maya. Maya wasn't a person to the Sterlings, she was a correction to a balance sheet. And she was being used by Silas just as much as Avery was. Avery's search led her to a nursing home in Queens. Her lead was Clara Benson, the head nurse of the maternity ward on the night of the switch. Clara was 80 now, her memory a flickering candle in a dark room. "The storm," Clara whispered, her hands shaking as she held a cup of tea Avery had brought her. It wasn't just a storm. It was a disaster. The basement flooded, and the backup generators failed. We had to move the babies in the dark. We were using flashlights, dear. Just flashlights. Did you see a maintenance worker?" Avery asked, leaning in. "A man named Silas. He would have been fixing the lights." Clara stared into her tea, her brow furrowing. "The lights, they didn't just fail. The breakers were flipped from the inside. I remember being angry because the maintenance man, the thin one with the cold eyes, he told us the wires were fried. But I saw him. He was by the bassinets. I told him to get out, that he'd bring germs into the nursery." "What was he doing, Clara?" He was touching the wristbands," Clara said, her voice dropping. "I thought he was checking the names to make sure we knew who was who in the dark. He said he was helping us keep track. He was so helpful. But then the power came back on, and he was gone. And the babies, they all looked the same in those little blankets." Avery felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It wasn't an accident. Silas Harding had intentionally plunged the ward into darkness, used his maintenance access to swap the identifiers, and then waited 23 years for the Sterlings to build a fortune big enough for him to steal. Avery left the nursing home and drove back toward the city, but she didn't go to her Soho apartment. She drove to the Sterling estate. She bypassed the main gate, knowing her code would be deactivated, and parked in the shadows of the servants' entrance. She found Maya sitting on the stone steps of the garden, smoking a cigarette, a habit the Sterlings would surely despise. "You shouldn't be here," Maya said without looking up. "Richard told the security to call the police if they saw your car." "Silas did it on purpose, Maya," Avery said, her voice urgent. Maya laughed, a harsh, dry sound. Of course he did. He's been telling me since I was 10 that life is a game you have to rig to win. You think I don't know he's a crook? No, you don't understand. Avery stepped into the light. He didn't just take advantage of a mistake. He made the mistake. He swapped us. He put me in that house so he could sue me for it later. He used you as bait, Maya. He let you grow up in that trailer, suffering, just so he could have a $5 million payday 2 decades later. Maya finally looked at her. Her face was pale in the moonlight. You're lying. You're just trying to save your money. Look at the records, Maya. He was the maintenance man that night. He flipped the breakers. Avery held out the payroll ledger. He didn't love you enough to give you a better life. He loved money enough to ruin both our lives. Maya grabbed the papers, her eyes scanning the dates and the job descriptions. The cigarette dropped from her fingers, smoldering on the expensive stone. He told me he was heartbroken when he found out we weren't his, Maya whispered. He told me he was doing this for me. To give me what I lost. He's doing it for Silas, Avery said. And right now, the Sterlings are about to sign that $5 million settlement. Once that money hits his account, he's gone. And you'll be left here with a family that doesn't know how to love you, and I'll be left with nothing. For the first time, the two girls looked at each other and didn't see enemies. They saw two versions of the same victim. What do we do? Maya asked, her voice trembling. We don't go to the lawyers, Avery said, her law student brain finally finding the winning move. We go to the one place Silas can't lie. We go to the Sterlings. But we don't go as the real and fake daughters. We go as a united front. Inside the house, Silas Harding was sitting in the Sterlings' library, a glass of 20-year-old scotch in his hand. He looked like a man who had finally won the lottery. Richard Sterling was holding a pen, poised over the settlement papers. It's a fair price for a life, Richard, Silas said smoothly. For my Maya's pain. The doors to the library swung open. Avery and Maya stood there, side by side. The price just went up, Silas, Avery said, her voice echoing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. Because we aren't talking about unjust enrichment anymore. We're talking about fraud. Silas's smile didn't falter, but his grip on the scotch glass tightened until his knuckles turned white. The golden life was cracking, but this time, Avery was the one holding the hammer. The air in the Sterling library was thick with the scent of old money, leather-bound books, beeswax, and the sharp, peat-heavy aroma of the scotch Silas Harding was currently swirling in a crystal tumbler. He looked entirely too comfortable in a chair that cost more than his trailer. Richard Sterling held a gold fountain pen over the settlement papers. It was a $5 million signature. A price paid to make the Harding problem go away and to fully welcome Maya into the Sterling fold. Then the heavy oak doors swung open. Avery and Maya stood there. They were a study in contrasts, one in a soaked designer coat, the other in a borrowed emerald gown, but their expressions were identical. It was the look of two women who had realized they were being played by the same master. Put the pen down, Richard, Avery said. Her voice didn't tremble. The princess was gone, the lawyer had arrived. Silas didn't stand up. He just leaned back, a smug grin pulling at his weathered face. Now, Avery. We talked about this. Don't make this harder on yourself. You sign over the trust, and you can walk away with your dignity. Mostly. Dignity isn't on the table today, Silas, Avery replied. She walked to the desk and dropped the damp payroll ledger directly onto the settlement papers, smearing the ink. But fraud is. Richard frowned, looking at the ledger. Avery, what is this? We've already been through the hospital records. We went through the medical records, Richard. We didn't go through the personnel records, Avery said, Her eyes locked on Silas. Silas wasn't just a father at St. Jude's that night. He was an employee. Specifically, an HVAC and electrical maintenance worker. He was on call during the flood. He was the one who fixed the breakers in the neonatal ward. The room went deathly silent. Even Eleanor, who had been standing by the fireplace, froze. I spoke to Clara Benson, Avery continued, her voice gaining strength. The head nurse. She remembers you, Silas. She remembers a maintenance man helping with the wristbands in the dark. She thought you were a hero. But you weren't fixing the lights. You were flipping them off so you could swap the tags. Silas's grin faltered. He took a long, slow sip of the scotch, his eyes darting toward the exit. The old woman is senile. You're grasping at straws, princess. It's not just the nurse. Maya stepped forward, her voice a low, vibrating growl. She looked at the man she had called father for 23 years with a visceral disgust. I remember the stories you told me when I was a kid, Silas. You used to brag about how the rich are just lockers waiting to be picked. You didn't love me. You didn't even want me. You just wanted a lottery ticket that took 20 years to mature. Richard Sterling stood up, his face reddening. He was a man who prided himself on his intellect, and the realization that he had been manipulated by a man like Silas was a bitter pill. Is this true, Silas? Did you intentionally swap those children? And what if I did? Silas spat, finally standing up. He slammed the crystal glass onto the mahogany desk. Look at her. Look at Avery. She's had the best life money can buy because of me. She should be thanking me. And Maya. She's a Sterling. She's got the blood. All I'm doing is collecting the commission for a job well done. It's called kidnapping and fraud, Silas, Avery said. And I've already sent a digital copy of these records to the district attorney's office. They're interested in why a maintenance worker at St. Jude suddenly retired with a 5-figure bonus from an anonymous source 6 months after the switch. Silas's face went pale. The bonus was the one thing he hadn't covered up, a hush money payment from a hospital administrator who had suspected the truth but wanted to avoid a lawsuit. You bitch, Silas lunged toward Avery, but Richard moved with a surprising speed, stepping between them. Leave, Richard said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Before I decide to let the police find you here. Silas looked around the room at the wealth he almost touched, at the daughter who hated him, and at the girl who had outsmarted him. He grabbed his worn jacket and stormed out of the library, the heavy doors thudding shut behind him like a gavel. The silence that followed was even more uncomfortable than the confrontation. Richard and Eleanor turned toward Maya, their faces softening into that parental look that Avery knew so well. Maya, Eleanor said, reaching out a hand. Thank God. We can put this nightmare behind us now. We can fix the lawsuit, we can clear the Sterling name, and you can finally take your rightful place. Maya looked at Eleanor's hand as if it were a strange, exotic insect. She didn't take it. She looked at Avery, then back at the Sterlings. My rightful place? Maya asked. You mean as your new project? You want to dress me up in Avery's clothes and teach me which fork to use so you don't have to feel guilty when you look at me. Maya, that's not, Richard started. It is, Maya interrupted. You didn't care about me until a DNA test told you to. And you, she turned to Avery, you're just as much a victim as I am, but they were ready to throw you into the street the second they thought I was a better investment. Maya looked at the room, the gold, the marble, the history. I don't want the Sterling name. And I sure as hell don't want the Harding name. I'm going back to Oak Haven. I'm going to finish my nursing degree on my own terms. I don't want your $5 million, Richard. I just want to be left alone. She turned and walked out, her boots clicking sharply against the marble foyer. She didn't look back. Avery stood alone in the center of the library. Richard and Eleanor looked at her, their expressions a confusing mix of relief and lingering coldness. "Avery," Eleanor said softly. "Darling, we made a mistake. The stress of the situation, the legal pressure, we were just trying to protect the family. You can stay, of course. We'll move your things back from Soho tomorrow." Avery looked at the woman who had raised her. She looked for the warmth she had felt for 23 years, but all she saw was the calculation. They loved the sterling daughter, but they didn't necessarily love Avery. "No," Avery said. "What?" Richard asked. "I'm not moving back," Avery said, her voice clear. "Maya was right. You didn't see a daughter, you saw a bloodline. And Silas didn't see a daughter, he saw a payday. None of you actually saw me." "Avery, don't be dramatic," Richard sighed. "You're a sterling in every way that matters." "Actually, I'm not," Avery smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it was a real smile. "I'm the girl who just solved a 23-year-old cold case using nothing but a library card and a sense of spite. I'm a pretty damn good lawyer, Richard. But I'm not your lawyer. And I'm not your daughter." She walked to the desk, picked up the settlement papers, and tore them into confetti. "I'll keep the Soho apartment for the rest of the month," Avery said. "After that, I'm on my own. I have some savings. I have my brain. And for the first time in my life, I don't owe anyone anything for the space I take up in the world." 6 months later, Avery sat in a small, bustling cafe in Brooklyn. Her hair was shorter, her clothes were thrifted, and her laptop was covered in stickers from local legal aid clinics. She was working as a paralegal while she finished her degree, paying for it with a student loan she had signed for herself. The news on the TV above the bar showed a brief clip: Silas Harding sentenced to 10 years for fraud and child endangerment. Avery didn't even look up. Her phone buzzed. A text message from an unsaved number. "Passed my anatomy final. Thinking of moving to the city to work at the clinic. Coffee?" Avery smiled and typed back. "Only if I'm buying, Maya. I just got my first paycheck." Avery Sterling, or whoever she chose to be today, closed her laptop. She wasn't an heiress, and she wasn't a victim. She was simply a woman who had finally discovered that the only family that matters is the one that sees you when the lights are off.